Pros, save more on the materials you need to get the job done, inside and out, at Lowe's. Right now, get 10% off in-stock Trex Naturals decking, now available in more styles. Plus, get 15% off select custom entry, interior, and storm doors. Then, we'll deliver it all straight to your job site to help keep your jobs moving. Get the brands pros trust, priced right, and ready when you need them. Our best lineup is here at Lowe's. Valid through 5/27. While supplies last. Selection varies by location.
You're listening to DNA ID, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Campus Killings, Below the Surface, and Killer Communications. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
On February 10, 2003, contractors were demolishing a section of basement in a 5-story dilapidated tenement building located at 301 West 46th Street in Hell's Kitchen on Manhattan Island. The workers were knocking through the concrete floor in the building's basement storage area, which had been rented to be used as a walk-in freezer by the restaurant on the 8th Avenue side of the street level called Rendezvous. The workers noted that in the far northeast corner of the basement, behind an old coal-burning furnace, there was a raised concrete slab that was 6 feet wide, 5 feet long, and a foot high. The raised slab seemed out of place and newer than the rest of the floor. One of the workers took out a sledgehammer and smashed it and discovered that it was hollow. Detective Robert Hahn told ABC7, quote, "One of them hit the cement slab. It cracked off and he discovered some material. I believe it was the rug the body was wrapped in. He started pulling on it and a skeleton started coming out. That's when he discovered there was a body in there," end quote. What popped out was a human skull. Of course, a raised concrete slab in the basement of a decrepit building hid a body. It's Murderer 101. The NYPD got the phone call about the human bones in the old building's basement. Detective Gerard Gardner was on duty that evening and caught the case by default. After clearing away more rubble, it was still impossible to tell what police were looking at. It was a mess of shattered concrete, deteriorated textile material, dirt, rocks, and some distinct man-made items. The most evident of these was an electrical cord, which turned out to be an extension cord in a tangled mess inside the pile of debris. But seasoned eyes following the cord saw the bones trussed up inside the cord's firm knots. The whole mess in and surrounding the shredded and tattered remains of the rust-colored wall-to-wall carpet remnant was removed to the crime lab. There, analysts carefully used instruments to pick apart and categorize each item in the rubble inside the carpet mesh. They isolated the bones, and when detectives viewed the result, they were shocked. The skeletal remains were hogtied by the electrical cord. Whoever the person was, he or she had been tied ankles to wrists behind the back, and the cord run around his or her neck, strangling them. The fetal position of the bones showed just how constricted the person was. Tiny remnants of pantyhose found near the neck indicated that the victim had possibly been strangled with both those and the cord. Then, the body was wrapped in the rust-colored carpet and encased under a whole slew of concrete in the basement. Someone really didn't want this person found. A forensic analysis of the bones by anthropologist Amy Mundorf revealed that the body was a white female. She was between 15 and 21 years old, based on lack of maturity of some of her teeth. She stood 4'11" to 5'4" and was a petite build. Her hair was reddish-brown or auburn. Her dental work was extensive, including fillings, crowns, and root canals, which indicated that at some point in her life she had access to money for dental care. But recent decay showed that she'd stopped caring for her teeth, consistent with being a runaway, police noted. One thing investigators were certain of was that Jane Doe was a murder victim. NYPD detective Kevin Zartorsky told the New York Times in February 2003 that the medical examiner had ruled Jane Doe's death a homicide. This was not a stretch given the hogtied position she was found in. But they had no idea when she'd been killed. Determining how long Jane Doe had been buried in the basement was very tricky. The medical examiner could not draw definitive conclusions from the remains other than that she'd been in her cement tomb for more than 10 years. So they used other physical evidence to try to figure out who she was and her timeline. The first of these was a 1969 dime found with the carpet rubble. The manufacture year of 1969 set the lower end of the timeline during which Jane Doe could have been killed. Another clue was a 1966 Bulova watch found on the remains. The watch had a serial number that Detective Gardner hoped would allow him to track its purchaser, but no dice. It turned out the digits were randomly assigned for insurance purposes, but were not documented according to purchaser. One of the most significant clues was a cheap gold-plated ring with the initials or letters P. McG that Jane Doe wore on her right pinky finger. Per the New York Post, Detective Gardner consulted the FBI to obtain a list of any women reported missing in the U.S. with a birth date after 1958 and the initials P. McG. He eliminated all 11 names because of their race, age, or other factors. The problem was that jewelers consulted by the NYPD reported that the letters could also be in a different order. This from America's Most Wanted, quote, "Jewelry experts police talked to said the initials could also be read this way, a first name beginning with a P, a middle initial of G, and the last name beginning with MC. That gave Detective Gardner a whole new set of names," end quote. He could not narrow this list down to his Jane Doe. Detective Gardner also compiled a long list of women with those combination of initials who had been arrested in the U.S. but failed to make headway there either. There were other clues to go on. A green plastic toy soldier was also wrapped in the carpeting, pointing to Jane Doe possibly coming from a household with children in it. And a hair found inside the carpet came back to a white male. I know you're wondering whether Jane Doe was clothed. The answer is that some remnants of clothing items were found with her that she may have been wearing. These included a size 32A bra, and we already addressed the pantyhose found around her neck. Scraps of glittery material pointed to her possibly wearing gaudy items or perhaps a costume of the type worn by a dancer. 7 buttons among the mess in the carpet pointed to a clothing item that bore buttons. And 2 loose garment labels were found with the remains. They bore very faded seals of workmanship that NYPD crime lab analyst Lisa Faber was able to read under a microscope. They were from the Lady Garment Workers Union, or International Ladies Garment Workers. The digits on the labels read BT 269287, which were thought to be manufactured around 1987. Ms. Faber was also able to make sense of some tiny shards of matching plastic that were found in the concrete grave. She pieced them together and determined they came from a plastic bag of Talon brand rat poison, produced only in 1979 and later. So the investigators penciled in the timeline. Jane Doe was buried no earlier than 1969, and based on the clothing labels, could even have been entombed in the basement after 1987. However, later historical evidence indicated the rat poison and labels might have been red herrings and or misdated, and the 1969 timeframe, the watch and dime dating from that period, was more accurate. The building housing the basement graveyard of Jane Doe had been owned by New York's famous Astor family. In the 1920s, it became a tenement, with the street level and basement housing various businesses. In the 1960s, the 5,000-square-foot basement had been the site of a famous Hell's Kitchen nightclub called The Scene, owned by famous music industry visionary Steve Paul. The Scene was legendary during its time, which spanned the years 1964 to 1969, and the venue hosted performances by the likes of Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, The Lovin' Spoonful, Blood, Sweat and Tears, B.B. King, The Velvet Underground, Pink Floyd, Fleetwood Mac, The Rascals, Aretha Franklin, Van Morrison, and Three Dog Night. This from Rolling Stone, quote, "Lines to get in went all the way to 8th Avenue. The Steve of Steve's Scene was Steve Paul, who personally oversaw admission. But he eventually abruptly shut down the thriving club, refusing to give in to mob pressure to pay them a cut of his take," end quote. The rough-and-tumble Hell's Kitchen location of the club thrust it right into the seedy underworld dominated by the mob, and the club was frequented and extorted by Paulie Walnut's actor Tony Sirico, and was also squarely in the territory of the Irish mob faction under the control of Mickey Spillane. Steve Paul preferred to shutter his club than to cave to mob pressure to withhold his liquor license and to rough people up. After Steve Paul shut down the scene on July 12, 1969, the labyrinthine brick basement spaces were used temporarily for rehearsal spaces by area performance groups and bands, and then another club opened in the space at the end of 1969. Later, it was occupied by massage parlors and an adult store in the 1970s, then a dive bar, and finally a restaurant. There was more than one entrance to the brick-walled, rabbit warren-like space, including through a steel trapdoor in an adjacent parking lot. The building was then demolished, and in 2016, the Riu Plaza New York Times Square Hotel opened at that location. A ton of work was done on Midtown Jane Doe's case by Detectives Gerard Gardner and Robert Hahn. All the physical evidence kept pointing back to the late 1960s timeframe, especially after experts decided the numeric stamps on labels found with the body had been mistakenly deemed 2 decades more modern than they were. The carpet, the electrical cord, the dime, the watch, they all pointed to about 1969, the last year during which the Scene nightclub was open. Perhaps Midtown Jane Doe, with her pantyhose and dancer's attire, had been a dancer at the club, or even a resident of the building during that time, detectives surmised. Police in 2003, trying to figure out who Midtown Jane Doe was and when and how she got underneath the basement floor, canvassed the sparse residents of the old building. Detective Hahn told ABC7, quote, "The people that resided in the building at the time were interviewed and had no involvement in the case as far as we could determine. They had no knowledge of the body. Information we have was that there were a lot of transients at the time that used that building for drugs and prostitution," end quote. In December 2003, the NYPD and Office of the Chief Medical Examiner released a forensic artist's sketch of Midtown Jane Doe based on measurements of the skull by Donna Fontana, forensic anthropologist for the New Jersey State Police. This from the New York Post, quote, "Last week, cops released a sketch of the victim, who they believe was of Irish descent, between 17 and 19 years old, between 4'10" and 5'4". Composite sketch artist Louis Trowbridge drew the skull to scale, then superimposed the flesh. The hair and other features are based on educated guesses," end quote. Tips came into the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, but none led to Midtown Jane Doe's real identity. They continued to seek ways to drum up tips, releasing a clay reconstruction of her face by the New York Academy of Art, entering her into NCMEC, NCIC, and NamUs, and even participating in a 2004 episode of America's Most Wanted featuring Midtown Jane Doe. In 2017, isotope testing was conducted on Midtown Jane Doe's bones. This testing assesses the elements in the bones to try to determine what environment she had spent time in. The results indicated that she had likely grown up in the Midwest. Perhaps she was a runaway who came to the Big Apple to make her fortune, as so many did. Quote, "At this point, we believe she was a young middle-class woman who probably hopped on a bus to New York full of dreams, but who ended up on the streets." Then lead detective Gerard Gardner told the New York Post in December of 2003. It seems the young woman's dreams had turned to nightmares. NYPD Detective Ryan Glass joined the Cold Case Unit in 2021. An experienced detective with 7 years in the 6th Precinct under his belt, he knew to look for contemporary suspects. But since he didn't know when Midtown Jane Doe had been killed, the timeline did not give him much guidance. He tracked down the building's former superintendent and questioned him, coming away with nothing. He interviewed serial killer Joel Rifkin, who was active in the 80s and 90s, a little later than Midtown Jane Doe was suspected to have been killed. Her manner of disposal also was not consistent with Rifkin's typical MO, which was to dump sex workers in 55-gallon drums in rivers or near highways. But science would soon come to Detective Glass's aid. Around 2020, the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner wanted to obtain an STR DNA sample from Jane Doe for comparison testing via NamUs and CODIS. They worked with Estrella Forensics, the private California lab of Dr. Ed Green, noted for obtaining DNA from rootless hairs and degraded samples. The bones from Midtown Jane Doe were an inhospitable environment for DNA, and the DNA was heavily degraded. Bradley Adams, head of forensic anthropology at New York City's Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, told Rolling Stone magazine, quote, "They'd probably spent the better part of a year working on it. They wouldn't take no for an answer, and they ended up with a profile," end quote. Not only did they obtain an STR DNA profile suitable for traditional DNA testing, they obtained a SNP profile of Midtown Jane Doe. Unfortunately, when the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner ran the STR profile through CODIS in March of 2023, they got nothing. Then Detective Glass started working with Parabon Nanolabs, which used the SNP profile to create a phenotype snapshot of Midtown Jane Doe. It showed that she was white, of Western European descent, and she had brown hair and brown eyes. It was time for an IgG analysis. Fortunately, the NYPD has a skilled veteran genealogist on staff for cases just like this one. They were one of the first agencies to hire their own full-time genealogist. When she uploaded Midtown Jane Doe's SNP profile in March of 2023, she obtained promising results right away. She found one genetic relative on the paternal line who was a first cousin, surnamed McGlone, and on the maternal line, a first cousin once removed. It was simple to perform triangulation to shared grandparents of these top two matches and locate the marriage of one of their three children, Bernard McGlone and his wife, Patricia Gilligan. Bernard and Patricia had one child together. Her name was Patricia McGlone, the P. McG of the gold ring on Midtown Jane Doe's finger. There was no proof of life for Patricia since 1969. Here is where Cold Case Unit Detective Ryan Glass stepped in. He started tracking down living extended family of Bernard McGlone, Patricia Gilligan McGlone, and their daughter Patricia McGlone. Detective Glass made contact with a woman in Florida who was in her 90s, who was a distant maternal cousin of Midtown Jane Doe, but still had sharp recall of babysitting some young cousins in Brooklyn, New York, decades earlier. She pointed Detective Glass to her nephew, who had some very important information. His sister, Patricia Carras, had been killed in the 9/11 attacks. Their mother had submitted her DNA to the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in order to have it on hand in case it was needed to identify his sister. According to documented family tree information, that mother was a maternal first cousin once removed to Patricia McGlone, and her profile was on file with the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. She was the closest known relative to Midtown Jane Doe, whose DNA the New York investigators had access to. A quick comparison of the two mitochondrial DNA profiles, Patricia Carras's mother's and the Midtown Jane Doe's, confirmed that they shared DNA consistent with being first cousins once removed. Midtown Jane Doe was Patricia Kathleen McGlone. She was born on April 20th, 1953, to mother Patricia Gilligan and father Bernard McGlone. She grew up at 375 52nd Street in Park Slope, Brooklyn. According to Detective Glass, Patricia was baptized at St. Patrick's on 4th Avenue in Brooklyn in July of 1953 and confirmed at the Basilica of Our Lady of Perpetual Help in Brooklyn on March 26, 1966 at age 12. Let me back up here and give some background on Patricia's parents. A Virginia marriage license the NYPD genealogist located for Patricia Marie Gilligan, a telephone operator, and Bernard McGlone, a trucker, reflected that they married on June 23, 1952. Bernard's profession was listed as the trucking business and his age at 45. Actually, he was 50 and already married. Patricia was 20 at the time. Their daughter, Patricia Kathleen, was born the following April. Bernard Sr. had two other wives and kids with both. He was married to a woman named Arlene, and they had two sons together before Bernard abandoned the whole family and married Helen Zatorsky in 1943. They lived in Brooklyn. Their son, Bernard Joseph Jr., was born there in August 1946. A few years later, Bernard Sr. married Patricia Gilligan and set her up in a house in the same neighborhood, Sunset Park. Helen had no idea that Bernard had another wife and daughter down the street until he left her for good in 1957 and moved in with Patricia and their daughter Patricia. His son with Helen, Bernard Jr., moved in with them at age 14 after Helen died of breast cancer in 1960. Bernard Sr. died in June 1963 at age 61. He left Bernard Jr. and Patricia each a little more than $1,700, about $17,000 today, under the control of his wife Patricia, to be paid to the kids in full when they turned 21. Patricia, her daughter, didn't make it to 21, not even close. She was 10 when her father, Bernard Sr., died. She attended Brooklyn's PS 94 and then the Catholic Our Lady of Perpetual Help Academy. She remained there until early 1966 when she was confirmed in the Catholic Church. Then she went to Charles Dewey Middle School in Sunset Park. Rolling Stone reports that Patricia switched schools one last time at the end of 1968, attending PS 136 for a mere 8 days before dropping out for good, although it's clear that after that, she attended St. Michael's Catholic School. Patricia never appeared in any of her school yearbooks, and no one remembers her from any of the schools she attended. She disappeared in 1969. When Detective Glass started to try to reconstruct Patricia's timeline after she was identified by IgG in early 2023, he was greatly aided by a 300-page investigative report that dug extensively into her family. Stay with me here as I get into how this report came about. Patricia's half-brother, Bernard Jr., basically turned into a con man and shyster. He dropped out of high school, lost part of 2 fingers in an industrial accident, and moved to Jersey City, New Jersey, where he was living in the fall of 1969 when he stole the identity of a man named Leonard Diamond. He used Diamond's credentials, including his degree from Ithaca College, to land a job as a bookkeeper for First National grocery stores. Bernard Jr. and some co-conspirators skimmed about $62,000 from First National via a check fraud scheme involving fictitious employees and left town with their haul. Trying to get their money back, First National commissioned the 300-page report on Bernard Jr. and his co-conspirators. In May 1970, the insurance fraud investigators went to Brooklyn and interviewed Bernard Jr.'s stepmother, Patricia Gilligan McGlone. They wanted to follow the money trail, so they documented his family history. And this is when Patricia told them that Bernard Jr. had a half-sister who had disappeared the year before in 1969. She said her daughter Patricia Kathleen McGlone had been married in the spring of 1969, had a baby, and then vanished. She didn't know what became of the baby. It was in this insurance fraud report that Patricia also reported her daughter Patricia had left school to get married, was addicted to drugs, and was hanging with people Patricia didn't know. The indication was that they were unsavory. Meanwhile, Bernard Jr. was caught and arrested on July 11, 1970, and while charges were dropped, he was forced to repay some of the money after he was sued civilly for wrongful misappropriation of funds. Okay, so based on this insurance fraud report from 1970, now Detective Glass knew that Patricia, aka Midtown Jane Doe, had been married and had a baby before ending up hogtied, wrapped in a carpet, and encased in cement in a Hell's Kitchen basement sometime in 1969. Patricia had been just 16 when this happened. Rolling Stone reports that when Patricia dropped out of her final school, St. Michael's, in May of 1969, school records reflected it was because of a medical event. This is believed to have been a pregnancy. And the records showed that she was imminently to marry a 32-year-old man named Donald Grant. Detective Glass was able to locate guardianship papers in a Brooklyn court in which Patricia's mother, Patricia, signed guardianship of her daughter over to her new husband, Donald Grant. The marriage took place on May 7, 1969, at the Church of All Nations on 2nd Avenue in Manhattan. Patricia's mom was a witness. The insurance fraud report indicated that Patricia's mom reported her baby was born in August 1969. She claimed that her daughter abandoned her child. And that was the last proof of life for young Patricia. The timing of her disappearance coincided with the summer 1969 closing of the Scene nightclub that had occupied the basement at 301 West 46th, and would have been the perfect time for someone to hide her body under a patch of concrete in the empty space. So obviously Detective Glass wanted to locate this Donald Grant, who, in his 30s, had married a girl who had just turned 16, right before she was believed to have been slain. Patricia had never been reported missing, not by her mother and not by her husband. Which one was more likely to kill her? Well, hold that thought. The problem is, Donald Grant was not Patricia's husband's real name. He listed his date of birth on their marriage license as February 27, 1937. Rolling Stone reports that a baby named Donald Grant was born in Ohio on February 28, 1937, and died in infancy. It appears Patricia's husband, twice her age, may have stolen this baby's identity and just made up the stuff he listed on his marriage certificate. This from Rolling Stone, quote, "There was almost nothing true about Donald Grant. His name was fake. His birthday was fake. The names of his parents listed on the marriage certificate? There was no James Edward Grant or Carrie Elizabeth Johnson with a son named Donald born in Pittsburgh," end quote. But one juicy detail on the marriage certificate is likely true. This from Rolling Stone, quote, "Grant listed his address at the time as 301 West 46th Street. A telephone directory from 1969 also listed a Donald Grant at this address. He wasn't listed there the year before or the year after. Grant also noted his occupation as musician, which was an interesting choice for someone who lived in the very same building as the Scene in its last year and who would vanish from the public record after the club closed," end quote. So, Donald Grant, or whoever he really was, lived in the very building where Patricia's body was found in the basement. And he was living in the cheap, loud, and chaotic building at the time of their marriage. Presumably, Patricia moved in with him there before she disappeared. Unfortunately, even though New York City detectives have been able to track down some of the former residents of the building, no one remembers either Donald or Patricia. The NYPD has not been able to locate the man using the name Donald Grant, who was married to Patricia and then evaporated into thin air around the time in which his young wife also vanished. Clearly, they did not run off together since Patricia got no further than the building's basement. Detective Glass told Rolling Stone he is a person of interest in young Patricia's death. Quote, with any homicide, you always look to the person closest, right? And especially if it's a domestic, end quote. There was another angle that very much intrigued the investigators, and that was the fact mentioned by Patricia's mother that she had given birth to a baby in August 1969, which she then, quote, abandoned. Where is that baby? This from CNN, quoting Detective Glass. With the information on her age and her being Catholic, her being married at such a young age with mom's permission, which wasn't out of the ordinary back then, we suspected that the toy soldier had something to do with her possibly being pregnant at the time, end quote. The investigators know that Patricia had a baby, but they don't know what happened to it. Of course, it most likely was adopted out, except no one can find it. More from CNN, quote, the search for the child has been complicated by the fact that back then, when a child was adopted or surrendered, the birth certificate issued had the name of the adoptive parents and not the birth parents, Glass said. In a very determined effort to locate this baby, the NYPD's genealogist has looked in every open-source DNA database and even worked with members of Patricia's extended family to search for any genetic relatives sharing DNA with Patricia consistent with being a child of hers, or even a grandchild. Nothing. Patricia's baby is either deceased or is alive and has never tested. As for the rest of Patricia McGlone's immediate family, her half-brother Bernard Jr. died in 2012. He was a lifelong grifter and conman who adopted stolen identities, claimed to have an MIT degree, and got in legal trouble for sexual contact with an underage boy. When he died, his wife did not know his real name and had to get him fingerprinted to try to figure out who he really was. She also did not know he had a missing half-sister. He never discussed his sister Patricia, for whose death he is still considered a person of interest. Investigators also wonder if the man using the name Donald Grant Patricia got mixed up with was perhaps an associate of Bernard Jr.'s. Then there was Patricia's mom, Patricia Gilligan McGlone. Before his death, Bernard Jr. wrote a private timeline of his life entitled Sad But True. In it, he wrote about his stepmother, Patricia, and her married boyfriend, George Leyburn, referring to them as very bad people. There is a reason that I hinted earlier that Patricia could have killed her own daughter. Remember that Bernard Sr., young Patricia's father, had left her and her brother Bernard Jr. each a sort of trust fund that they were to be awarded when they turned 21. His wife Patricia was the trustee and was charged with paying sums out to the young beneficiaries as needed and then paying out the remainder of the trust when they came of age. This from Rolling Stone, quote, on May 15, 1971, Pat made one last plea for Patricia's money. The girl was 18, Pat wrote in her application to the surrogates court in Brooklyn. Her Social Security payments were set to stop, and she needed this money to survive. Patricia's signature didn't match her handwriting. It looked an awful lot like her mother's, though, end quote. In other words, with her daughter Patricia already deceased, her mother Pat forged her signature to access the funds designated for the missing girl. Notice that she did not tell the court that Patricia had been missing for 2 years, instead producing a signature she claimed was her daughter's. So, of course, all of that makes me wonder whether Patricia, the mother, and her boyfriend at the time could have killed her daughter in order to access her money. It's entirely possible. The only reason I lean against that is because, according to the investigators, whoever buried Patricia McGlone in that basement had to have an intimate knowledge of the labyrinthine floor plan and access to it during the 5 months in which the basement was unoccupied between August and December 1969. There is no connection between Pat the mom and the building at 301 West 46th that I know of. Further, apparently, in order to lay a 6 feet by 5 feet, at least 1 foot deep concrete slab, about 45 bags of concrete mix and possibly even braces would be required. That's a big job. I don't know if I see Patricia and her boyfriend pulling it off. Patricia, the mom, died very young in 1972. The only reason we have the vast majority of the information we have is because she was interviewed for that insurance fraud investigation in 1970. Any other secrets she had, she took to her grave. It's my understanding that the investigators have not been able to locate a single photo of Patricia McGlone. It's crazy to think about what an almost non-existent footprint this poor girl left, with virtually no one caring that she was alive for 16 years before ending up murdered in a Hell's Kitchen basement concrete slab. As Detective Glass put it, this case is a true puzzle. Despite the very suspicious feeling I get about Patricia's husband, her murder and cement encasement in the basement does not really call to mind a typical spousal murder. She was hogtied, for God's sake. That goes to something much less personal than an abusive husband. Mafia, her shady brother, her mother and her boyfriend, a serial killer. Your guess is as good as mine. I really wanted to know whether the NYPD and Office of the Chief Medical Examiner are facilitating a genealogical analysis on the hair of the white male found in the carpet with Patricia McGlone's remains. Unfortunately, after waiting more than 18 months to get permission from the NYPD Public Affairs Office to speak with Detective Glass, my request was flat out denied last week. Believe me, I'm just as frustrated as you are about this. It seems to me, in a case with as many unanswered questions as this one, it would be beneficial to get as much information out there as possible. But clearly, someone in charge at the NYPD has other ideas. So all I can do, other than tell this story as I understand it, is to request that if anyone has any knowledge of anything about Patricia McGlone, Donald Grant, or the baby Patricia born 1969, please contact Detective Ryan Glass of the NYPD Cold Case Unit. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. Before you leave, please let me tell you about some important things related to the show. If you'd like to support this podcast, and in the process, get access to early and ad-free episodes, as well as bonus content like crime scene photos, you can sign up for a Patreon subscription for only $5 a month by heading over to patreon.com/DNAID. Of course, you're welcome to contribute more than $5 a month. We rely on Patreon funds to pay for the original source materials I use to research each episode. If Patreon isn't your thing, you can also show your support with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts. It costs just $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year. Your AbJack Insider subscription will give you the same benefits for not only DNA ID, but for all of the shows on the AbJack network, like Killer Communications and Campus Killings. Head over to Apple Podcasts and find the DNA ID page or look for the AbJack network to get started. If you're on social media, we'd love to interact with you there. DNA ID is on every major social media platform. Search your favorite platforms for DNA ID Podcast to find us. We also have a YouTube channel, and our website is dnaidpodcast.com. You can find links to all of these anytime in our show notes. If you need to reach the show, contact us by emailing dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Finally, if you want to pick up some fun DNA ID merch and represent the show, visit the store at www.customizedgirl.com/s/DNA ID podcast. DNA ID is researched, written, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt.